Racker and Heimann on countertransference, similarities and differences. How countertransference became a therapeutic tool. Part 3. Paula Heimann. Paula Heimann, born in Poland, in Gdansk, in 1899, trained as a doctor in Berlin, was analyzed by Theodor Reich and supervised by Karen Horney and Hans Sachs. She became an associate member of the Berlin Psychoanalytical Society in 1932, but moved to London in 1933 because she felt her life was under threat from the Nazi regime. She was accepted as an associate in the British Psychoanalytic Society in 1933 and met Melanie Klein in 1934, at a time when Klein was distraught after the death of her son in a climbing accident. Heimann helped in a secretarial way with the paper that Klein eventually presented on depression at the 1934 IPA Congress in Lucerne, Klein 1935. Heimann became friends with Melanie Klein, and Klein advised going into analysis again, with Klein herself. The analysis continued intermittently until 1953. In 1939, Heimann became a full member of the society with her paper on sublimation, published 1942, probably in response to Anna Freud's The Week Before, see Hinshelwood 1997. Heimann remained at that time close to Klein and emerged as a central player in the special scientific meetings organized for the controversial discussions, 1943 to 1944, giving one paper herself and a joint paper with Susan Isaacs. The sole-authored paper, published 1952, was on projection and introjection and is clearly relevant to her thinking about the process of countertransference in the analytic relationship. After the controversial discussions, she remained a central member of a much-reduced Klein group and was very involved in training students. The entangled relationship with Melanie Klein continued into the 1950s, Grossgirth 1986, and eventually involved a difficult process of emerging as a more independent thinker. The first step in that independence was Heimann's paper on countertransference, presented in 1949 to the IPA Congress in Zurich and published 1950. She did not seek advice from Klein, and she received disapproval. Plausibly, it was a bid for independence, though her final break did not come until years later, in 1955. Her two significant contributions to the revision in thinking on countertransference, and her more cautious review of her own ideas in a paper simply called Countertransference, presented in 1959 and published 1960, were in that context. Though her 1950 paper is often quoted as the seminal statement of the change of direction, in fact, many others had offered their own reflections on the analyst's emotional reactions. Ballant and Ballant 1939. Brearley 1937. Rickman 1937-39, and around the time she wrote her paper, in 1949, there were others who were reconsidering countertransference. She mentions Alice Ballant, 1936, and Berman, 1949. As she said in a footnote, the fact that the problem of the countertransference has been put forward for discussion practically simultaneously by different workers indicates that the time is ripe for a more thorough research into the nature and function of the countertransference. Heimann 1960-1959, p. 81n. In fact, there were a number of others she did not mention, including Gittleson 1952-1949, Little 1951-1950, Reich 1951, Racker, and Winnicott 1949. Some of them she must have known, such as Winnicott and possibly Little, who gave her paper to the Society in 1950, but did not grasp Heimann's point clearly. We can only guess that Heimann omitted more references out of loyalty to the Klein group. Interestingly, her first analyst, Theodor Reich, published his most well-known work, Listening with the Third Ear, in 1948, the year just prior to the Zurich Congress. Reich's book concerns the way in which the analyst must use his own unconscious to discern the patient's unconscious meanings, and it is hard to think there was not a connection with her work. Heimann's presentation in 1949 was the year after Racker's paper to his society in Argentina. There is no evidence that Heimann knew Racker or his work then. Heimann's paper was short and to the point, in fact, only about 2,800 words including a vignette, remarkable for a text that some would say changed psychoanalytic history. The trenchant clarity and incisiveness give the paper a force not equaled by others writing on countertransference at the time. It was, as she implies, the right paper at the right time. Her key point is emphatic. My thesis is that the analyst's emotional response to his patient within the analytic situation represents one of the most important tools for his work. The analyst's countertransference is an instrument of research into the patient's unconscious. Heimann 1950-1949, page 81. It could not have been a plainer challenge to the 40 years of suspicion before that date, originating when Jung, and also Ferenczi, were caught up in struggles with their erotic responses to female patients. Stefana 2015. See Stefana 2017b for some reflections on erotic transference and countertransference. Heimann noted how her students told her of the unemotional stance required at that time. Here is one of her students from the 1940s. She, Heimann, was taking a seminar on Freud's papers on technique, and she had asked me to summarize the main points in his paper, Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis, Freud 1912. When I came to the recommendation that analysts should take as a model the surgeon who puts aside all his own feelings, Paula Heimann, to my surprise, strongly disagreed with Freud's emphatic recommendation. She formulated her point of view later in her paper entitled On Countertransference. King 1989, page 5. Heimann tersely stated that the aim of the analyst's own analysis, from this point of view, is not to turn him into a mechanical brain. Heimann 1950-1949, page 82. Rather, it is to open him to a free-floating attention, unaffected by intense feelings which risk impelling him to action. This conflict between reflecting on one's feelings or allowing them to become an impulse to action was a key to the listening activity. He should listen to the manifest and the latent meanings of his patient's words, the allusions and implications, the hints to former sessions, the reference to childhood situations behind the descriptions of current relationships, etc. Heimann 1950-1949, page 82. She was moving towards an understanding of the analyst's use of his effective response on one hand, as opposed to being overwhelmed by his feelings which then distort the work. Remembering that the analyst's feelings are the patient's creation can protect him from entering as a co-actor on the scene which the patient enacts in the analytic relationship. Heimann 1950-1949, page 83. It is that remembering which is the trick the analyst has to perform, though that may be difficult given the intensity of feelings and with the uncertainty in oneself, especially whilst the analyst is still inexperienced. She recognized the work involved. As Rayner, 1991, summarized. For her, the use of the term countertransference is restricted to incidents where there is a time lag between the analyst's unconscious and conscious understanding of the patient's communications. Instead of comprehending the patient's projections in good time, on such occasions the analyst unconsciously introjects the patient and experiences a consequent puzzling sense of unease. p. 215. This reaction involves a time lag, elaborated in detail later on by the Kleinian Moneycurl, 1956-1955, when he described normal countertransference and being stuck in either a projective state or an introjective state. The point is to take up Freud's injunction to attend to the unconscious communication. This rapport on the deeper level comes to the surface as the most dynamic way in which his patient's voice reaches him. In the comparison of feelings roused in himself with his patient's associations and behavior, the analyst possesses a most valuable means of checking whether he has understood or failed to understand his patient. Heimann 1950-1949, page 82. The emotions of the countertransference arise from a role the analyst is required to play and can be used to check whether he has understood the narrative displayed in the associations. Hinshelwood 2013. That is, he can make a comparison of his feelings with the content of the patient's association. Finally, she made a brief recommendation to refrain from confiding the countertransference to the patient. They're a tool to understanding the patient and not the other way around. If the analyst confides his feelings, it places, she thought, a burden on the patient. At this point, Heimann returned to a point of disagreement with others who she had mentioned at the outset of her paper, notably Alice Ballant, 1936, who suggested that such honesty on the part of the analyst is helpful and in keeping with the respect for the truth inherent in psychoanalysis. p. 61. Heimann also added a similar note before publication of her paper, referencing Berman, 1949. A vignette in her paper describes a man drawn to and intending to marry a woman who had been traumatized, and this was associated with a transference dream depicting the analyst as a woman from abroad who needed repair. This burdened man, she tells the reader, came to mind in connection with her argument about the countertransference, implying the burden of feelings a psychoanalyst must bear. However, Heimann also recalled more personal aspects of the kind of burden an analyst bears. Later, apparently, King 1989, Heimann recognized that she had been brought up as a replacement child by a mother burdened by the death of the previous older sibling. And Heimann's entangled relationship with Melanie Klein had started at the time when Klein had suffered the burden of the bereavement over her son's death. These associations about the burdened analyst/mother seem to support Heimann's interest in the recommendation against burdening the patient too with one's own countertransference feelings. Despite Heimann's centrality in this topic of countertransference, she wrote only one other significant paper about it. 10 years later, she contributed to a symposium on countertransference held by the medical section of the British Psychological Society in 1959. Heimann did three main things. She gave an outline of her main argument in the earlier paper. She attempted to disentangle what seemed like a more ordinary form of countertransference. Others, like Moneycurl 1956, had called it normal countertransference, but Heimann did not use that term. And thirdly, she gave an account she had failed to give in full in the earlier paper regarding the reasons for not confiding one's feelings to the patient. She started by reconsidering Freud's 1912 Steely surgeon analogy, suggesting that detachment is a defense against the analyst's threatening feelings of uncertainty or of sexual feelings. She repeated the claim that analysis is a relationship between two persons. It is not the presence of feelings in one partner, the patient, and their absence in the other, the analyst, but the degree of feeling the analyst experiences and the use he makes of his feelings, these factors being interdependent. Heimann 1989, 1960, page 152. Heimann also repeated crisply that the analyst's own analysis is not to turn him into a mechanical brain which can produce interpretations on the basis of a purely intellectual procedure, but to enable him to sustain his feelings. P. 162. Sustaining feelings is not easy if they are intense, and there is a time lag between the unconscious disturbance and the conscious awareness of what is disturbing. As he waits, which he must do in order not to interfere with an ongoing process in the patient, and in order not to obscure the already puzzling situation, still more by irrelevant and distracting interpretations. The moment occurs when he understands what has been happening. The moment he understands his patient, he can understand his own feelings. Page 153. She is clearly following a different recommendation that Freud had given. He must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. Freud 1912, page 115. Heimann noted the paper by Gittleson that contrasted the obstructive and unanalyzed neurotic aspects of the analyst's reaction with the tool-like useful countertransference, the first, emanating from a surviving neurotic transference potential. In the analyst, p. 155. The other type of countertransference, Gittleson described, Heimann called actual countertransference, page 155. It is that created by the patient via the role that the transference demands of the analyst. In these instances, the analyst will be more willing to employ a self-analytic inquiry and can therefore preserve his receptiveness. Finally, Heimann gave a detailed account about speaking one's own countertransference feelings. She says that in practice, she would go so far as to indicate when she thought she had made a mistake and would make a correction, without going into why it had occurred. Like all sorts of things in the analyst's personality, and indeed in his room, the patient has the opportunity to know the real analyst. In turn, his mistakes are a further opportunity for the patient to know him. However, the analyst does not explain why he has a certain piece of furniture in his room, and she says, the patient has many opportunities in life where a person apologizing for a mistake will give reasons for it. He has only the analytic situation in which it is exclusively and consistently his prerogative to be the object of research into reasons and meanings, page 157, italics in the original. The analyst is not a real person in that sense, since in that real role an analyst is as useful to the patient as any Tom, Dick, or Harry p. 157. One of the analyst's main resistances is the wish to retreat into an ordinary relationship, confiding mistakes, or a personal state of mind. And this corresponds to the resistance expressed in preserving a deadening detachment of neutrality. On the other hand, a more receptive countertransference response to the patient's transference will be when the analyst employs a self-analytic inquiry and can therefore preserve his receptiveness. Overall, this later paper is not so clearly written and is rather obscure in parts. Indeed, Heimann was rather unsure about including this paper in the edited collection. See Heimann 1989, p. 160n. However, it does amplify in various ways the brief first paper in 1950. One of the least clear passages is Heimann's attempt to use Gittelson's paper to distinguish normal countertransference from the analyst's transference to the patient. Heimann's ability to find a beautifully clear form of expression for an idea is not evident with this issue. It is only some time later, in 1975, when she was dealing with a more general description of the mental work of the analyst, that she managed to make this crystal clear. These comments, in 1975, are therefore worth adding to the two papers dedicated to countertransference. The paper on observations on the analyst's cognitive processes was presented to the Canadian Psychoanalytic Society and published 1977. Those few comments differentiated the normal use of countertransference from the neurotic reaction to the patient. She clarified the difference. Transference is the psychoanalyst's problem. Countertransference is not a preformed attitude applied to the patient, but a specific response to the patient, Heimann 1975, page 299, and thus created by the patient, not the analyst. Most of the time the functioning of the countertransference demands our attention only when something has gone wrong, page 299. When it goes well, it is like walking, which one does not have to think about once the method has been learned. But the countertransference can go wrong, and when it does so, the patient's created countertransference has touched a neurotic transference in the analyst. At that point, the analyst has to engage in a piece of self-analysis for the neurotic problem he, the analyst, has created. This addendum in 1975 was written after Kleinian authors had also made contributions to normal countertransference and to a pathological form, for example, Bayen 1959, Moneycurl 1956. Klein feared countertransference always indicated a disturbance in the analyst. She thought that the new conceptualization of countertransference allowed the analyst to attribute everything to the patient, so that she commented that she learned more about herself from the countertransference than about her patient. Quoted in Spilius 2008. Klein never published her views, perhaps out of respect to Heimann, although in her notes she did attribute some diagnostic value to countertransference. See Hinshelwood 2008, 2016. Heimann wrote much less than Racker about countertransference because she was interested in other topics. First, she was occupied with defending Melanie Klein's discoveries up until about 1955, and then subsequently. She sought to establish her own somewhat divergent position. She never fully moved to the position of the independence as she retained her commitment to the importance of destructiveness, which increasingly took on the nature, for Heimann, of a reservoir of instinctual aggression located in the ID. And she tried to embody it within Freud's classical structural model, rather in the manner of classical ego psychology. However, there remains no evidence that Heimann was influenced by Racker. Racker, on the other hand, noted Heimann's first paper in one of his own in 1952, see above. Margaret Little, 1951, almost contemporary with Heimann's first paper, acknowledged Heimann's use of countertransference as a kind of signal anxiety promoting a heightened awareness of the emotional events occurring. Rosenfeld, 1952, endorsed Heimann's views, especially with schizophrenic patients where the analyst's intuitive unconscious understanding has to stand in for verbal communication. Marion Milner, 1952, Stefana 2011, 2019, at that time close to Klein and Winnicott, also endorsed the countertransference as part of the analytic data p. 188. There were in all some 17 authors, including Racker, who endorsed Heimann after her original postulate in 1950 and with little real dispute. Summary of the points of Heimann's argument. 1. Listening according to Rake. 2. Projection and introjection in the Klein/Abraham paradigm. 3. The analyst's feelings are a vital tool for investigating the patient's subjective state. 4. The unswerving opposition to the analyst as a mechanical brain observing a surgeon's neutrality. 5. Sustain one's feelings as opposed to discharging them, using feelings as the key to the unconscious. 6. The actual countertransference is a normal, non-neurotic reaction. 7. Analysis is the space for the patient's feelings only, not the analyst's.